We're going to dive in first to gluten and cancer. What we're looking at here are a couple of research studies, and what I want to point out, we can kind of blow this up a little bit, but conclusion down here, I'm going to read you the conclusion of this. This is a major research study published in Biomed Central. Conclusion: celiac patients have an increased risk of developing cancer in relationship to the age of diagnosis of celiac disease. This risk results in higher malignancies in the gastrointestinal sites. So let's talk about what that really is saying. I want you to understand what this research is actually saying, is that the later or the longer it takes for a person who is gluten sensitive to get a diagnosis, to find out whether or not gluten is creating the problem. In essence, the longer in their life that takes. So maybe you were diagnosed when you were a kid. If you were, you went gluten-free, fantastic. That pretty much can mitigate your cancer risk as it relates to gluten induction of cancer. But if you got a diagnosis when you were in your 40s or in your 50s, you have to understand that the longer it takes in your life to get that diagnosis, the greater risk for you to develop cancers. What this study is showing, that cancers that you develop, the greater the risk in the gastrointestinal area. So that's what that's referring to right there in the GI tract. This other research study, malignancy and celiac disease effect of a gluten-free diet, what we've got, you can see down here, that the risk is increased, however, in those taking a reduced gluten or a normal diet with an excess of cancers, had an excess amount of cancers of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, so your mouth, your throat, your esophagus, and also of intestinal lymphoma. So again, I want to point out, this study looked at two different groups, actually three different groups of people. The study looked at one group of people who found out they had celiac disease and went on a strict criteria gluten-free diet. The other two groups, one was a low gluten diet group and the other was a, we're not going gluten-free, we're going to do what we want. Well, in the two groups that didn't fully go gluten-free, again, what we're seeing here is an increased risk of cancers of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus. Okay, and so these R stands for relative risk increase. So you can see here that the relative risk, the increase of risk was 22.7% for the development of cancer. But when it came to lymphoma, the increased relative risk was almost 80%, 77.8% increase in risk. So a significant decreasing trend in the excess morbidity rate over increasing use of a gluten-free diet was found, meaning the more gluten-free a person was, the less risk for the development of those cancers they were over their lifetime. So again, two major studies pointing out that the first one, the earlier the onset of diagnosis of figuring out that you need to go gluten-free, the lower the risk. The later, the higher the risk. And then, of course, in this study showing individuals that were gluten sensitive and dividing them up into groups of people who were willing to go gluten-free and people who were not willing to go gluten-free, finding greater risk in those who didn't actually adhere to a gluten-free diet. And much greater risk, as I showed you, lymphoma increased almost 80%, the relative risk increase. Another study recently published, association between celiac disease and cancer. So what you can see here is, however, failure to adhere to a strict gluten-free diet bears the risk of adverse events and increases mortality. A considerable number of studies have considered the possible association between celiac disease and neoplasms. Neoplasms is just a fancy way of saying cancer. In particular, an increased risk of malignancies. Let's back that up. Malignancies such as cancers of the GI tract, intestinal lymphoma has been reported. This is a review of studies. So anytime we look at a review, is a research article that's published that reviews multiple different studies and weighs the quantity of evidence to show is there a relationship or is there not a relationship, and then they give their summary, which is what this says, is that we summarize and discuss the evidence of the association between celiac disease and cancer. Now, here's what that evidence says. So this diagram is directly coming from this review, and so what I'm giving you and showing you here is kind of a summary. So the things in red, so as we look at this, the things listed in red here with the red background, I'm putting a little green dash by them all. These are all studies that show those not following a gluten-free diet who needed to had an increased risk of development of these different types of cancer. So large intestine, colon, esophagus, multiple studies on esophageal cancer. And you can see here, multiple studies on thyroid cancer. You've got papillary thyroid, you've got regular thyroid cancer, pancreatic cancer, melanoma, which is a form of skin cancer, oropharyngeal hepatobiliary cancer, which is, again, liver cancer, gastric cancer, liver cancer. So all these research studies have been done showing an increased risk for the development of these types of cancers in people who were gluten sensitive. Again, not adhering, the key here is not adhering to the gluten-free diet. So let's blow up this diagram for you. What you're seeing here is kind of a summation of what the research says on gluten and increasing the risk and the different types of cancers that are increased. So again, increased cancer risk for those with gluten sensitivity of the mouth, the esophagus, the throat, the stomach, the intestinal lymphomas, colon cancer, rectal cancer, the thyroid gland, the liver, the pancreas, and the skin. Okay, now what's very important to understand here is that cancer risks were negated following a strict gluten-free diet. So these studies show that even though you are at greater risk for developing cancer from gluten, from consumption of gluten, these risks were negated following a strict gluten-free diet. This is really where the power's at, right? Because the power's in you. If you follow the diet, so diet change, meaning if we're trying to mitigate our risk, some people would say, well, what's the point? I have celiac disease. If I have an increased risk of cancer, who cares? I'm not going to do anything different with my diet. But what I want you to understand and take away is that if you change your diet, if you adhere to a strict gluten-free diet, these risks are actually mitigated. They actually go away. And now, that doesn't mean you can't get cancer, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other risk factors associated with the development of cancer. However, you mitigate your gluten-related risk for developing cancer. And I think that's the important takeaway, is that you have the power to change your diet. When we're looking at a disease that kills 1 million people a year, just in the U.S. alone, you want to have every power that you can over that. In talking, I was saying earlier, cancer kills 1 million people a year. We're talking, these are U.S. statistics. So again, what I'm trying to give you is some sense of hope around cancer. If you've ever experienced somebody in your family, if you've known anybody who's ever gone through cancer, you know how devastating it can actually be. It's the real deal. It's a very, very serious illness that can affect people. And so 1.5 million diagnoses just in the United States alone. So 1.5 million people diagnosed with cancer every year in the U.S. 40% of you, okay, both men and women, will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. These are statistics coming from major research studies. It's the second leading cause of death. Some would actually argue that it alternates between the first and the second, and it's not really the second, because cancer and heart disease each kill about 1 million people a year. And so sometimes some years cancer overrides heart disease a little bit, and some years heart disease overrides cancer a little bit. So, and again, depending on the statistics that you read, but it's between the first and second leading cause of death a year, with about 1 million deaths. Think about this, 1,600 people die from cancer every day. And this is actually a very conservative statistic. The numbers are actually, according to some research, much higher even than this. But you think about that, 1,600 people die daily from this disease, and half of all cancers could be prevented. And this has been very well documented. Half of all cancers can be prevented with choice. And so what is that choice? That's diet change, right? Which is what we're talking about here. It's why, it's such an important component that if you are a gluten-sensitive individual, diet, lifestyle, alcohol, exercise, activity, tobacco use, what you choose to eat, what you choose not to eat, whether or not you get sunshine, the stress level that you subject yourself to. These are all choices, right? These are all things that we do on a daily basis. And so if half of all cancers could be prevented through this, then why, why? This is really the big question. Research. Why, if the research shows this, why do the hospitals downplay it? As a matter of fact, how many of you have been to a hospital where you got a diagnosis of cancer, knew somebody with a diagnosis of cancer, and the hospital referred you to a nutritional department or to a functional medicine department and said, hey, because we understand and appreciate and know that the research says that half of all cancers can be prevented with your choices, so we want you to have some consultation, right, with people who understand nutrition, people who understand lifestyle medicine. How many of you, again, with the experience of cancer, how many of you have ever been to a hospital where that was the standard of care, where you were sent over to a wing of the hospital where you were consulted on nutrition, diet change, exercise, lifestyle change? Raise your hand, speak up. If you're there, just chime in. Now, how many of you on the opposite end of that? So if you've had that happen where you were in a hospital-based setting and they did refer you to nutrition, just type in nutrition in the feed here. Now, if you were in the hospital setting with cancer or taking care of somebody with cancer and your doctors basically told you to eat as much ice cream and soda and just keep your calories up so that the chemo didn't waste you too much, how many of you were not told anything at all about nutrition or told that nutrition wasn't really all that important? And if you were told nutrition was not important, just type no nutrition in the box. I'd just like to get a poll to see how many of you actually were led down this. Because again, these aren't my numbers, folks. These are numbers. This is actually the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine published these numbers. That's where these numbers are coming from. You can see approximately 40% of men and women in the United States will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives. Half of all these cancers could be prevented because they're choice-based, right? Now, there are cancers that, certainly there are factors around cancer that we don't understand 100%. There are a number of things that we absolutely understand. And we know, for example, genetically modified foods, we know that sugar, we know that processed foods, we know that processed MSG, monosodium glutamate, among other things. We know that a lot of factors around diet. We know lack of sunshine, lack of vitamin D can cause 19 different forms of cancer. How many of you with a diagnosis of cancer were ever told, get outside, go get some sunshine? Most people are told, hey, don't get sunshine when you're going through chemo because your body can't handle all the radiation. So you're being told to avoid behaviors that are actually cancer preventative in an effort to take on more poison because your doctors are trying to race killing the cancer with poison instead of giving you intelligent lifestyle factors and changes to make, which, your body can beat cancer. You should know that. Your body can win against cancer, but it can't win if it doesn't have the tools that are necessary. What does your body need to beat cancer? It needs good nutrition. It needs love. It needs a supportive environment. Your body needs sleep. It needs an adequate sleep, not partial sleep. It needs rest, right? Your body needs good food. It needs exercise. It needs to be mitigated away from chemical exposures as much as possible. So things like tobacco and alcohol on frequent basis use, those things are contributed to cancer. The chemicals, and I would argue even with tobacco, I would say tobacco is probably a lot less unhealthy than what we've been told. And one of the bigger problems with tobacco today and big tobacco is that it's loaded with chemicals. It's loaded with manipulative chemicals and pesticides. And so, we've got cultures like blue zones. If you guys don't know what blue zones are, they're areas across the world that have been researched for longevity, meaning these are cultures that generally have the highest percentage of population of people that live to be 100 plus. And so many of the people that live in blue zones actually smoke, right? But they're not getting the exposure to the chemically loaded, genetically modified tobacco. So many of the things that we're currently being exposed to. So now, this is not me advertising to you that tobacco is okay just buy it organically. I still think it's a bad idea. However, these are mitigating risk factors that we can control, and if we choose to control them, we can reduce our risk dramatically. Half of all cancers could be prevented. So you have to understand that with cancer, it's not, you don't wait till you get cancer and treat it. It's about prevention. The key word here, it's about prevention. It's not about treatment. By the time you already have the cancer and it's time to treat it, you've already got a major, major problem on your hands and a major, major battle. And that battle, I can speak from personal experience with this, that battle is more than just, hey, I need to eat right and exercise. You're not just battling what you have been doing in your diet and lifestyle. You're battling a complete social paradigm. You're battling doctors scaring you. You're battling your own family members trying to coerce you into doing things not naturally, but chemically and artificially. Like, there's so many different elements of what you're actually going to battle when dealing with cancer. And so that all that warring, all that internal battle, all that strife creates a huge degree of stress. Again, stress being one of those lifestyle components that contributes to the increased risk of cancer. So, my advice to you is prevention is where it's at. Prevention is why we eat right. It's why we sleep. It's why we exercise. It's why we get sunshine. It's why we surround ourselves with loving, caring, concerned people who have our best interests in mind. It's why we avoid, I'll say the proverbial life vampires that we all have in our lives sometimes that we're exposed to. That's prevention. It's about taking care of yourself and not waiting for the illness to coerce you into prompting action to take care of yourself. It's why many of you are listening to the show, right? As you're trying to figure out better ways to take care of yourself as opposed to necessarily coming back from illness or disease.
Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.